Are you present? Do people feel like you care about them? None of those things you can actually do effectively without mindfulness.
Welcome everyone. I am delighted to be joined by Matthias Birk, who is the Global Director of Partner Development at White & Case, previously Global Head of Coaching at Goldman Sachs, and also several other roles, including Professor at Columbia and NYU. And among that is also a great patron of Iventive. Matthias, I know you've been joining at least as long as I've been with Iventive, so 5 years, and it's always a delight to have you in the room. And particularly one topic that across the 5 years that we've been connecting that I know you are passionate about and have always prioritised is mindfulness, particularly around senior executives. So I'm delighted to have some time to speak with you a little bit about that, about mindfulness practices, how people can implement that in their day-to-day, and the impact that you see mindfulness having at a business level as well.
Yeah, very good. Thank you for having me. And thank you for letting me be part of Iventive. As you said, I think the first one I joined must have been 2014 or 2015. So I think it's almost 10 years. And it's always been a real privilege and fun to connect with so many amazing folks.
Wonderful. You've probably been to more than I have.
Could be. Well, thank you for always having me.
Of course, it's always a pleasure. And I tell you, your passion and particularly your reflection has always come through in any of the conversations we've had. Why is it that you feel mindfulness is a core skill, not just for people, but particularly for those at senior executive level positions?
Yeah, so such a great question. Maybe let me start first with from a personal angle. So I started practicing mindfulness when I was a teenager, actually in the 90s. And I was largely looking for a way to, let's say, tame my anxious mind. I was a very anxious teenager. And I realized I'd wake up in the morning and all these anxious thoughts running through my mind. And I grew up in the northwest of Germany. It was the mid 90s. Wasn't necessarily the high time for mindfulness, but I think I had an intuitive sense of there must be a way to kind of tame that anxious, overly active mind. And I've been practicing meditation, particularly Zen meditation, which is really just a very basic form of mindfulness meditation, if you will, more or less since then. At the outset, really just for my very own personal benefit. And now to your question, I'm an organizational psychologist by training and a recovering academic. I originally thought I would, stay in academia, and then basically did what they, in academia, they say you sell out. And I started working as a consultant for McKinsey in their organization practice, where we designed leadership development programs and ran leadership development programs and worked on organizational change. And then over time, it actually took me a few years to realize what I had started doing for myself, my own meditation practice, was really core for what we were doing for leaders. And if you think about it, mindfulness became more of a thing, I guess, or more popular than, in the 2000s. But the way it kind of moved into organizations was largely through wellness programs, because they realized people were stressed out and there were high burnout rates. And so as part of the wellness offerings, a lot of organizations were saying, hey, we're going to offer mindfulness courses, and it helps people regulate their stress, which is great. This is partly how I got into it. But I realized even beyond managing stress or managing burnout, a lot of the things that leaders need to do really require mindfulness, if you call it mindfulness or not, right? Because what is leadership at the end about is you have to develop strong relationships across the board with the people on your team, with your peers, with clients. You have to instill trust. You have to be seen as someone that has executive presence, if you will, right? And it's already in there, right? The executive presence. Are you present? Do people feel like you care about them? None of those things you can actually do effectively without mindfulness. Or another way to say it is, for many of those things, that's what I realized that we do in leadership development programs. Mindfulness is almost like a baseline capacity. In other words, like if you can't manage your mind to be present, we don't really need to talk about how to give great developmental feedback, right? Because if you give me feedback, Hannah, and I realized you're kind of distracted, you're somewhere else, you're stressed, then how are you going to be present? Oh, I had my daughter who's joined me for work today, and she was just showing me her yogurt face. So the way I have started to train leadership development, both when I teach it at Columbia, for example, or in our programs, is to make sure people understand this isn't some kind of nice to have tool, like, oh, someone is doing yoga and I do mindfulness. No, mindfulness is the ability as you run through your super stressful day and there's an emergency here and you just got this email and you come from a very challenging meeting and now you got to be present, right? Now maybe you have to have a difficult conversation, you need to give feedback, or you got to really be present with the client, is the ability to manage our inner environment to be, as much as we can, be completely here, right? Can I manage my own presence? And I find that most of the time, once the leaders I work with realize that, they're very open to it, right? Because it kind of moves it out of this somewhat seemingly esoteric space to like, oh, it's really just about how much can I be here with whatever is right in front of me instead of with the bazillion other things that are going.
And approaching, whether it's a meeting or whether it's a larger decision, with intention, and thinking about, am I in the right frame of mind to make this, to make this call, to have this meeting. I think it was interesting what you said as well, as it's mindfulness even if you don't call it that, because some people can roll their eyes at certain terms, but really it's about, is it better to have a 30-minute rambling conversation or a 15-minute conversation where we've had the first 15 minutes to stop and think and reflect and know the points we want to make, know the outcomes we want to have, and approaching all of that time with intention.
Yes. Yeah. And, just to share an anecdote, because I do this often, every once in a while I get someone who's like, I don't do mindfulness. And then I usually just ask them, well, do you breathe? And they're like, oh, that's a dumb question. Of course I breathe, right? And then I ask them, well, can you pay attention to your breath? And they're like, that's another dumb question. Obviously I can, right? And then I say, well, there we go, right? You just did mindfulness. That's at the core of mindfulness. Pretty much all mindfulness practices is simply, can I take my mind away from some thought I was just going off into, and place it back into my belly breath, which is always in the present moment, right? And I think for leaders, this is so hard for most of us. We're leaders because we're so overscheduled. And we have so many things we have to do, especially in this time, right? And even as you and I are on this Zoom call, like someone might ping me, right? Today, my daughter is in the office with me. She might come around. And then the tendency of the mind is to, constantly jump, meaning like it's in the present moment. 1 second, I'm listening to you. Then the next second, my mind went off. Oh my God, are we going to be delayed on these shipments? I need to check in, and off my mind goes, right? And so what we do in mindfulness is like when we go to the gym, right? You train the muscle to get stronger, is we train the muscle of being present, right? Always back. And the other thing, I work a lot with lawyers. Unfortunately, there's the research on like, the intersection of leadership and mindfulness is still very young. But what I tell them, lawyers are very concerned about doing great client service. And at least to my knowledge, there's no real studies yet on how it impacts that. There's a lot of studies from the hospital space, right? And there's research that shows when doctors engage in mindfulness training, they're able to be more present with their patients. They can listen more, they can look them in the eyes, they can kind of slow down, because doctors have a similar challenge, right? They're constantly behind, and oh my God, I got to see the next patient. Here's an emergency. And then there's studies that show that presence with patients actually translates into patients giving higher ratings to how they feel, like how well they were being treated, which also makes sense, right? Most of this is pretty straightforward. And so this is what I try to, when someone says, hey, I have no interest in mindfulness, then sometimes I'll ask, well, do you have interest in doing good client service when they're a lawyer? And they're like, yeah, of course, that's my job. I'm like, well, think about it like this, right? When you go see a client, the same, of course, is true for, when you come home to your spouse or your boyfriend or girlfriend or your team, of course, but can you be present with them? Can you pay attention? Or are you just constantly like stressed out and somewhere else?
You mentioned there that the intersection of leadership and mindfulness being in its infancy, but do you have any examples perhaps from your own work or conversations that you've had with peers of mindfulness, positively affecting leadership or strategic decisions, different paths people may have taken as a result of taking that pause, that's led
Yes.
you to be such an advocate for it, both in your day-to-day job, but also online and in your professional life as well?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't have, I'm not working as an academic anymore, so I don't have any hard data. It's just more anecdotal evidence, right? But just let me give you an example of just one of these pieces of application. So one of the things I've done over the past, over the past years, of course, everyone has walked through this question of how do we bring people back into the office instead of in Zoom meetings. And so I did a town hall, I believe it was last year, where I talked to our New York office, the folks here, about how when we are in the presence of others and others are listening to us, what that does to our nervous system. And there's all the studies that show that when people, when you're in the presence of others, there's actually something going on that we call co-regulation, right? So it's for our mental health, it's very good to be around others, especially when we are in the company of people we perceive as caring for us. But of course, what can happen in any firm where people are busy is that, you're in the office, but I'm walking down the floor and I'm typing on my iPhone. And so one of the things I did with them also kind of to demystify mindfulness, right? So the way I think about mindfulness is always when I'm intentionally practice present moment awareness. That can be that I get up in the morning and I practice 15-minute mindfulness, but that can also be that I go to a meeting. Before I start launching into the agenda, I just make sure I'm seeing everyone, or I'm paying attention. Oh, hi, good morning, Hannah. So one of the exercises I did with them, which they probably hated, is to say, just turn to your neighbor and for a moment, just look them in the eye. I did this at the last Iventive that we had here a couple of months ago, which of course people always says a little bit nervous laughter is kind of awkward. And then I say to them, look, that's all right. Just, pay attention to the nervousness that comes up. But there's something always that happens because we're human beings when you gaze into someone's eyes where you're like, okay, like, ooh, this is pretty. This is like an intense moment, right? There's vulnerability, there's intimacy that develops, and people always feel kind of touched. And so we had a little bit of a discussion of what does that mean for us, right? And so there's this one person that came to me after and he said, hey, this is really interesting. After you did the session, the next morning I made a conscious attempt to, when I came in, to walk down the floor and really make sure that I'm making eye contact with everyone and just, and he said it was interesting because originally I thought, well, I'm just going to do that so that my team feels better, right? Oh, the leader is kind of, but he said, like, when I then came to my office, I felt so good. It felt really good. And I think sometimes we forget, we're human beings, and yeah, we come to work, and of course, a large element of work is you need to get things done and so forth. But there's also a large element, and that's especially relevant in this conversation about back to the office. That's just about what's it like to, be around other human beings, and can I create an atmosphere where people feel cared about and present. And of course, I can do this I can put on like big events and stuff, but I can also do it very simply, right? As a leader of saying, I'm here, I'm seeing you, I'm having a meaningful connection with you. And that was even for me was an interesting piece, like that person's realization, that, I don't know, maybe it took like a minute and a half or two out of his day. It's not a big investment. But this act of being mindful with, I'm here, you're here, I'm presencing myself with you, not only probably had an impact on his team, but it had an impact on himself, and so I think that's that's the other piece I would say that's unique about, when you do mindfulness work with leaders is in the wellness space, it oftentimes feels like, oh, I'm doing this for myself, right? I'm doing mindfulness so I don't burn out. But of course, when we're a leader, we're also like creating a culture and we're creating, um, we're in a way, if we like it or not, co-regulating our team, right? So if I'm, as the leader of my group, come in and I'm frustrated and I'm stressed and I'm high strung, whether I want it or not, and there's so much science out there on emotional contagion that shows it's immediately gonna spill over to your team. And then you can ask yourself, yeah, is that what you want, right? Do you want your team to be stressed out or feel like overwhelmed, depleted, or do you not? And if you don't want that, and I think most leaders don't, well, then you better have some kind of technique to regulate your environment so that I can go in. And even though, like, things might be hectic, I just had a meeting like this morning where we have like an important event, and I have a person on my team who's amazing, but I could tell, okay, she's like stressed out. You know this probably from like running events where there's always like things that change last minute, and you feel like, oh my God, there's a catastrophe. And I think part of what we do as leaders is obviously we have to solve the problem is first to say, hey, okay, so it's all right, let's be present. Because the reality is when you're present and you're breathing and you're here, you're actually in an optimal space for problem solving, right? Like, it's not an optimal space to be stressed. So in a way, I think that's most leaders understand that intuitively too, is like the first task is always self-regulate, but then when you meet with others, it's to co-regulate. We don't use that word, right? You wouldn't go to someone and say, oh, let's co-regulate agenda item number one, right? That'd be weird. But it doesn't have to be on the agenda. I think it's more as like, as a leader, do you realize that every moment you spend with someone is essentially a co-regulation moment, right? You're working with someone else, you're working with your own and someone else's nervous system. And again, I work with lawyers who work a lot with clients too, right? Or it's for other people that might be important customers. But it's the same thing, right? Like when you interact with a customer, the customer feels like whether they intuitively feel you have your act together, you're on top of things, you're grounded, you're present, or are you like stressed out somewhere else, have an agenda? Are you really listening? That people feel that.
And seeing every interaction as an inflection point, not just on your day, but on their day, and all the conversations that will come out of that.
Yes, exactly. I mean, this especially, it's a great point you're mentioning, because I always think like the higher people get in seniority, the more important this becomes. And I sometimes share this example, people say about Bill Clinton that he had this ability to, make you feel like when he was with you, he was completely with you. Whether that was like honed political savvy or, I don't know. But I actually, many years ago, happened to be involved in some work that we did for the Clinton Foundation. And I always tell that story because it's really a remarkable leadership learning moment for me. So we did some facilitation work for the Clinton Foundation on like strategic direction and so forth. And like we would at Iventive, right? It's a big room and there are like a dozen flip charts, and I can't even remember exactly what we did, but at every station, like we were talking about some different topic. And I was, relatively junior associate, and I had like a name tag and it said Matthias, and I was one of a dozen facilitators. And it was a full day workshop, and Bill and Hillary Clinton came in for an hour, I believe, some point in the afternoon. And of course, you can imagine, right? First, the Secret Service comes in, and then everyone is excited. Oh my God, the Clintons. And so they come in, and Bill goes from kind of station to station and his team is like circled around the flip chart and walks him through, okay, here's, the suggestions. And so he finally comes to the flip chart where I was standing, and, the team was standing around, and I was kind of a little bit in the background, because I was just a facilitator. And then so he looks, he kind of scans, and then he sees me and he reads my name tag, and then he says, hold on for a second. And he reaches through his team and, gives me his hand, shakes my hand and said, hi, Matthias, thanks for being here today. And it was such an kind of leadership lesson for me, because like you were saying, how long was it? That took him 2 seconds. I still talk about it today, right? Like a decade later, right? Because I was so touched about it, that someone, that obviously has so much stuff going on, and there's these 100 people that want his attention, is like first order of business. That's what I took away, was to say, have I connected with everyone? And now again, you might say, cynics might say, okay, that's a politician, that's their job. Fine. But the larger takeaway is, like, if you're a CEO or C-type level leader, there's so many opportunities, right? Where any moment that might matter little to you can matter so much for other people, right? That if you go in the elevator and you shake someone's hand and you say, what's your name? Oh, thank you for working here. Thank you for doing this. Like, why waste those opportunities? All it takes is presence, and at the end of the day, like mindfulness too, those are like concrete practices. I believe, who knows? I'm not an expert on Bill Clinton, but just to stay in the example, it's probably a habit. He trained himself to say, first order of business, connecting. And I think, sometimes this is a little bit about demystifying mindfulness. It's just getting leaders to recognize to check in with themselves, is like, are you fully present? And if not, most of us aren't most of the time, do you have a simple technique to bring you back? Going to the breath, taking just a tiny moment before I go into the next meeting and checking in with, like, how am I doing emotionally? Am I able to shift? When I meet someone, can I just look them in the eye, even if it's just for half a second, and make this connection? So yeah, but yeah, I think your point of saying the more senior people are, the more you're actually making someone else's day, is really critical for people to understand.
There's a phrase I try and live by, and I actually said it to a colleague just today, which is, character is how you treat those who can do nothing for you. And that's what I try
Yeah.
and approach my day,
Yes,
because
I love that. I'll share another anecdote with you.
yeah.
Many years ago, I did a facilitated workshop for the CEO of a hedge fund. And that person grew up in incredible wealth, right? So that person was used to, like, constantly having people around themselves. And when I did the workshop for him and his team, I noticed it was one of those situations where where we're in some kind of fancy hotel, and there were constantly people coming in and bringing goodies, like new tea or new coffees or new pastries. And I noticed that every time, even when we were in the middle of a conversation, he would pause and he would wait to make eye contact with whoever brought something in and say thank you. And it was noticeable, right? So that I asked him in the break, I said, wow, I realized you're doing this. Curious, is this intentional? And he said, yes. And the story he shared is that at some point he needed to be in a board meeting in Hong Kong and wasn't able to be at his mom's, I think, 70th birthday party or something. And then last minute, the board meeting gets canceled, and he decides to kind of, I guess, play a joke on his family, and dressed up as a waiter and said, I'm just going to be there. People don't know I'm there, and I'm just going to be there with the champagne along with the other waiters. And he said, like, family friends come in and they take a glass of champagne and they don't recognize him. And then his brother comes in, same thing. And his mom comes in, and he realizes, like, there are all these people that know him, but he felt completely invisible, because for them, to your point, they categorized him as, oh, this is just someone that does something for me, who I take for granted, right? I don't look at them. I just take a glass of champagne. And that was a real awakening moment for him, like how terrible that was, that he was treating, how terribly he felt being treated like that, not being seen. And then he made this conscious intention. And I think that's exactly what you're saying is like, are we, yeah, it's in a way, part of it is leadership technique, but part of it, I think, as you're highlighting, is it's values based too, right? Like, who do you want to be as like a human being? And are at a minimum, right? Like, even if you're in an environment, market environment, company environment where you have to do tough things or deliver tough messages, like, can you muster up the ability to give people your full attention, especially when you're like one of the ultra privileged ones, right? Where everybody's doing everything for you.
And I always think it can be self-interested too. So it's nice to be nice, but also if you do pay attention to everyone around you, you don't know who it may be that will, open the shop that 30 minutes later for you, or the EA that might find half an hour time in a busy diary for you because you've taken the time to get to know them. So I think you can convince people that way. In the examples of modeling this behavior, one example I know you've shared in an article is of a senior executive who carved out time specifically in their afternoon schedule for mindfulness, and had a window, an office with windows, so their whole team could see them practicing mindfulness, which I thought was a really great example of setting the culture, co-regulating, normalizing it as well. Are there any other examples that you could share or suggest for how leaders could implement practices into their day, but also show to be modeling that behavior as well?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Well, I would say I would differentiate between, let's call it explicit mindfulness, and I don't know if you would call it implicit mindfulness, but the implicit mindfulness, by implicit, I mean where you practice mindfulness without having to talk about mindfulness, right? So some of those examples you and I just talked about, let's say you sit down with someone, you make sure you take a moment to see them, check in with them, you take a breath, right? You go to a meeting, you take a breath before you go into the meeting. Those are all things I think you can role model without having to call it mindfulness, right? And I think people pick up on it, and because role model learning is such a big part of learning, it'll probably affect the more senior you are, the entire organization, just because people are like, oh, I guess this is how we do things here, right? I think that's great. The other piece I think is also good, like the one in the example I gave in the article, where there was a senior executive who had taken a mindfulness class and realized, oh my God, this is so effective for me, and was very vocal about it, right? Not trying to like talk others into it, but said, look, I took this class. This is the following impact on me. I'm gonna make this a regular practice in the afternoon. And so at the beginning, people were a little bit like, "Oh, what is this? Is this weird?" And then it became normal, right? Like many of these things. But to your question, I think a few others are, and I see actually more and more teams do that. Let's say you have a team meeting, and to your point, like ideally you want everyone to be present so that the team meeting is efficient, but you also wanted to create a moment where people feel like there's some genuine connection. And most of the time people come from other meetings and are stressed. And so making it part of the agenda to say, hey, let's have agenda item number one, a moment of mindfulness. And that can simply be to say, let's take 30 seconds, just everyone take a few conscious breaths and check in where you are. But the mindfulness is always like, can I pay attention to what's happening right now? Could also simply be a check-in, right? Where we say, let's go around and simply talk about what are we feeling right now? And ideally we try to stay away from like, especially in the US, when you say, how are you feeling? People are like, oh, I'm good, I'm good. Usually what I tell people is like, this good is a values judgment, right? But it's like, can you kind of check in with my body and say, oh, right now, I feel kind of tense. Now that I check in, I feel tense. And then the next person might be and say, I feel tired. And then the third person might be, I feel a little bit anxious. And there's science is very strong about that when we name what's happening for ourselves, it automatically helps us regulate it. Right? That's why writing the diary or talking to a therapist for that effect is so helpful, right? I've spent many years in therapy. I don't know if you've ever been with a therapist, but what therapists do is like they'll ask you to talk about your feelings, and then magically you get better because talking about what's going on for us helps us process. And so that's one, right? Just going around checking in with people. You can also do another check-in where you say, hey, if we had a scale of 1 to 10, energy level, 10 being, hey, I'm full of energy, I'm excited, 1 being like, I got nothing left. Let's just do that, right? And all it does is just help people create a moment of self-awareness. I've had a few people, do things where they say, hey, let's come in and we'll all just take 1 or 2 conscious breaths. And you'd be amazed how, that's what, 15 seconds, but how different the meeting starts when everybody takes 2 breaths together. Maybe one last example, when I worked for a couple of years at Goldman in their partner development group, and we did a training there to help partners manage their energy. Part of that was mindfulness, but part of it was being more mindful of nutrition and exercise and so forth. And I ran into one of the partners afterwards, and it was, one of those interesting learning moments where he said to me, Matthias, like that training completely changed how I work. And I was like, oh, wow, I want to hear everything. And he said, well, on my calendar, I now put every 90 minutes, like a 5-minute block, and I walk, down to the water fountain and I get a glass of water. And I was like, okay, great. What else? He was like, no, nothing else. And I was like, what do you mean? Like, that does not sound very transformative to me. And he said, no, you don't understand. Like, I used to just, like, it was just constant, like the stress would build up and I would keep going, keep going, keep going. And I've realized in the training that I need to put a conscious habit in to say I have to pull myself out every 90 minutes. And then, of course, there's an element of walking. I guess there's an element of hydration. He wouldn't take his phone, right? So you could argue it was always almost a little bit of a walking meditation, right? Now, I haven't talked to that person for a long time. I don't know if they still do it, right? That's part of the challenge with this is like, yes, sometimes after these trainings, we're like, oh my God, this is amazing. I got to do it. And now I meditate in the morning. And then 3 months later, they're like, oh my God, I'm back to my old routine. So it's also always like, I usually tend to tell people who have this like big realization around mindfulness and then they want to do 10 things. I usually tend to say, no, don't do 10, do 1. And if you think you can do 10 minutes, do 2, right? Because better is to do less, but find something that's sustainable than to do a lot and then realize, oh my God, I can't squeeze it in. Do you know what I mean? So so yeah, and all of those, I think that's the beauty, I think, with being a leader, and especially with something like mindfulness, is that I've never met anyone that hasn't included any type of mindfulness habit and that hasn't had a positive impact on them. But as a leader, anything you do that's has a positive impact on you, if you want it or not, has a positive impact on others. It's like when you're a parent, right? Like if you manage to, instead of being stressed out, being calm and centered and caring and kind and empathetic, that's huge, makes a huge impact on your family. And the same is true as a leader, right? If I, beyond the kind of technical skills I might bring or, decisions I can make or the strategy that I might, be better at than my competitor, if I can get myself to a point where I'm present and I'm sympathetic and I'm compassionate and I'm here and I'm able to listen, that, obviously it feels great for yourself as a leader, but it has ripple effects, right? That's what makes working with leaders from my personal perspective so rewarding. It's always like, you have such leverage, It's great. Anyone should, from my perspective, anyone should practice mindfulness, but leaders should especially do it, right? If it was up to me, every leadership program, and certainly the ones that I'm involved in, always have an element of that, would have a mindfulness element. I really believe strongly that there's very few leadership tasks that don't actually underneath have a strong mindfulness component. if you call it that or not.
Mhm. I think it's so interesting, and particularly maybe as a leader reflecting not what's my role as a leader, but what's the maximum amount of ripple effects that I have in my day. So how do I conduct myself that I'm positively impacting all of those ripple effects? And perhaps just as a final reflection, I know one of your 4 pillars when approaching your own mindfulness and meditation is finding a community. And maybe people think meditation as a singular and individual practice, but you found that actually finding a community has really helped make it sustainable. I saw a parallel there with iVentive about finding a community. But
Yeah.
how important for you is it to take it outside of just your own reflection and find others?
Oh, it's super important. And I think I'll just say that for most people I know, and I've been practicing meditation myself for decades now, and I've worked with a lot of people who've tried to make this a habit, is even though the vast majority of people, when they practice mindfulness, feel an immediate benefit, it's very hard. And I think the problem is, is to a large extent this, right? It's always like, oh my God, I feel anxious, and why don't I just like check New York Times or LinkedIn or what is there, or Instagram or whatever, or TikTok? And like, I'm always like, our mind, especially when we're already stressed, we have a fair amount of adrenaline in our body, oftentimes doesn't want to sit still. It wants to like do something that's easy. And because oftentimes when we do sit still, the first thing we are confronted with is like, oh my God, there's a lot of stress going on in the system. And, like with all of these things, I guess similarly to if you want to take up like running or, taking those first steps, especially until you've been able to create a strong habit, to do those in community is just so helpful, right? So if okay, and this is the great thing now about the times we live in, like, yeah, you can go to a physical group. I do that. I have a group, that I go to and I teach in New York. But there are so many virtual groups, right? There's a magazine I write for called the Tricycle Magazine. They have a Monday, I think it's 11 a.m. Virtual meditation group, and it's 30 minutes, right? Or it could be, of course, even better. I've done this here at White and Case together with one of my colleagues. We started a regular White and Case mindfulness group. It was 20 minutes once a week. So, it's kind of manageable amount of time. And a lot of people got so much out of it. And that's the other thing, again, as a leader, especially as a leader. I think if as a leader you realize, oh, this is so good for me, and you say, like the person I mentioned in my article, I'm going to do this, I'm going to commit to do this every Thursday at 2 p.m., whatever. And you invite other people to say, hey, we're going to do this very basically. We're just going to meet. And, you can either use an app or a recording or simply say, we just do this and we sit there and we try to pay attention to our breath, or someone can facilitate it. There you have your community, right? It doesn't have to be something fancy, but it is this idea that whenever we try to do something that runs maybe a little bit counter to our, mind, our minds are very addicted to like distract. They will constantly want to be entertained. And, mindfulness in a way is kind of untraining the mind from that. Just be with the breath. Can I just be with the tension? Can I just be with the nervousness? Then to do that with one other person, right? Or 2 other people, there you have your community, And that's the other beautiful thing, of course, is if once you start initiating that, you're obviously using the community for your own benefit, right? Because now I'm like, oh, I don't want to meditate, but it's 2 p.m. on Thursday. I guess I have to. But you're also giving that benefit to others, right? Because they also probably are in the same boat. I'm like, oh my God, I have so much to do, but okay, I committed to Matthias that I would do my 15-minute mindfulness, So that's the beauty about some of this. And also I think this great opportunity in leadership, and we really take it seriously, right? Is this like there's so much we are giving, right? And by the way, just maybe as a last point, most of the people, if not all, they're at work, but they go home to like their other kind of, their families or their roommates, or their partners, or maybe just their cats. I don't know, right? But when you impact the people that you work with at work, it also impacts like how they show up at home. All right. Like it has an immediate translation effect into like how they're interacting with their family. And that's what a beautiful privilege, right? When you really own it as a leader to say, like, I'm, in the best of cases, how I think about it, in the best of cases, you're helping people be better human beings at the core, right? And that just magically and naturally translates into better salespeople and better lawyers and better parents and better coworkers, because at the core of that, all of that is about, are you trustworthy, compassionate, present human being? And that's quite a privilege, right? Anyone has with any leadership responsibility. So I think that's another part of mindfulness, if you want to call it that or not, is like getting people realize that huge privilege and the responsibility that comes with it.
And perhaps in the era of AI, where we're hearing every day about another thing that AI can do faster, better, more efficiently, it's a moment to pause and say, well, what can the humans do? What can my human intelligence do? And be really intentional with that. And as you say, the effect that you have on people, I think is a real opportunity at that time. So thank you so much. I always come away from these conversations with so much to think about. And I always, again, set myself micro goals of like, I need to be implementing this more in my own day. And even in the sessions that we run and taking the time to reflect. Really appreciate your time with us here today. And of course, Matthias joined several of our sessions in New York, but as a global director as well, with a company with employees around the world. Always welcome to join us if it's in Dubai, if it's in Singapore, or in Northwest Germany as well. It's a real pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for your time.